How's it going, everybody? Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason, and in today's video, I wanted to take a look at the CFL standings with 5 or so weeks left to go in the CFL season, go over all the possible playoff scenarios, who can make the playoffs still, who's a long shot to make it, and all the seeding associated with it. So on the board here, I have the current CFL standings as of week 15 of this season, and then at the bottom of the board, I have some key tiebreakers that could come into play as we go forward at the end of this season. So, starting in the West Division, at the number one spot right now, we have the Winnipeg Blue Bombers with a 10-4 record. They have a remaining schedule of home against Toronto, at BC, at home against Edmonton, and then at Calgary. So, there's some challenging games in there theoretically. I think that game against BC is going to be huge. I don't know how much Toronto's going to go all out to win that game in a couple of weeks because Winnipeg's on a bye week this week. So we'll see how Toronto does in that game against Winnipeg and if they play all of their guys, considering they've already locked up first place in the East. But I think that game against BC is going to be huge for deciding first place in the West, given that these teams are tied in the loss column, and the winner of that will get the tiebreaker this season. And I mean, that game against Edmonton, you can't take Edmonton for granted right now with the way that they're playing. So Winnipeg should still finish first or second in the West. I guess it's still technically possible that they finish third, but it's probably not going to happen. So they're probably going to finish first or second, and it's all going to come down to that game against BC. Now, similarly, for second place here, you have the BC Lions with a 9-4 record. These teams evened up in the loss column last week after Winnipeg lost and BC came back against Ottawa. So BC's remaining schedule is at Edmonton. A very interesting game this week. I think that's a potential upset alert there. Then they're home against Saskatchewan, home against Winnipeg, as I said before, and then they're at Hamilton, a team that they lost to a couple of weeks ago, and then they're home against Calgary to finish the season. So, I mean, like I said, it's all going to come down to that game against Winnipeg, it looks like. Assuming there's no drastic change in the standings where there's, more than a one-game gap between these two teams before their game in a couple of weeks. So, again, it's all going to come down to that Winnipeg versus BC matchup for first place in the West, it does seem like. And then moving on to number 3, Saskatchewan is where it gets really interesting. Saskatchewan 6-7 on the season, has lost their last 2 after starting 6-5 this year. Their remaining schedule is at Ottawa, at BC, versus Hamilton, at Calgary, and at home against Toronto. So I think the key thing for them is this week against Ottawa. So Ottawa is down in the dumps right now. We'll talk about them in a few minutes. But, I mean, I think that if Saskatchewan loses this game to Ottawa somehow, I expect them to win. I think everybody expects Saskatchewan to go into Ottawa and win. But if they lose this game, it really does open up the door for other teams to potentially jump them in the standings in a few weeks. Because, Calgary's 2 games behind them right now. But there's still a possibility, as I'll talk about later, for Calgary to get that tiebreaker. And, right now there's a 2-game gap. So if they lose this game, Calgary wins this week, then it opens up the opportunity for Calgary to jump them via tiebreaker at the end of the season. So I think Saskatchewan needs to stop the bleeding after losing a couple of straight games here. And I think that game against Ottawa is a perfect opportunity for them to do it. I think the magic number for them to make the playoffs is 8 wins. So I think they could easily get 2 more wins of those 5 games that they have left. So interesting to see how the rest of their season goes. They've kind of been an up and down team as the seasons went along here. And then number 4th place is the aforementioned Calgary Stampeders with a 4-9 record. Obviously, they have a very long playoff streak that is on the line these last 5 games of the season, and I think there's a very good chance that they miss the playoffs here. But as I was saying before, the formula for them to make the playoffs is probably win 4 of these last 5 games, which sounds crazy for a team that's only won 4 games on the year, but I look at the schedule and I say there's some winnable games here. So they're versus Montreal this week. I think they could win that game at home. They're at Hamilton the week after. I think that game's a little bit 50-50. I think both teams will be desperate to win that game. Then they're home against Saskatchewan. that game decides the tiebreaker between Saskatchewan and Calgary. So that could be very key if Saskatchewan drops a game to, say, Ottawa this week, like I was mentioning. And then they're on the road against BC, and then they're home against Winnipeg. Now, those last two games seem very challenging on paper, but I mean, Winnipeg, the last week of the season, depending on what shakes out with that first place battle, either of those teams could potentially, BC or Winnipeg, not have much to play for those last couple of weeks of the season. So we'll have to see how that shakes out, and if there's teams resting players in the last week of the season, it could have a big influence on the standings at the end of this year. And then 5th place, we have the Edmonton Elks, who are suddenly surging here with a 4-10 record. Unfortunately, they have 4 games remaining compared to a lot of other teams that have 5 games remaining. Their remaining schedule is at home against BC this week, at Toronto, at home against Montreal, and then at Winnipeg. So a couple of really hard games on the schedule on paper, but like I said, with Toronto is a big wild card because they've already locked up first place in the East with 6 games remaining. So we'll have to see what they do in terms of playing all their starters the rest of the season, but we'll have to see how Edmonton does these last 4 games because, I mean, they're very much a long shot to make the playoffs, specifically because they actually, unlike Calgary, have already lost the season tiebreak to Saskatchewan, so they have to outright be a better team in terms of the record than Saskatchewan. The crossover looks very, unlikely at this point with Hamilton and Montreal both having 6 wins, so we'll see what happens with that. But Edmonton, just such a great signs to see, how well they've been playing lately, and we'll see if they can finish strong this season. So, I mean, they'll probably have to win out to have a chance at the playoffs, but, I wouldn't doubt them at this point, given how they've shown lately. So that is the West Division. I think, like I said, Calgary hopping Saskatchewan is still technically possible. The margin of error for Calgary is very thin at this point, so I would expect Saskatchewan to still make it, but that is definitely a possibility. Edmonton would have to win out in order to really get back in the mix here, and then Winnipeg and BC are really just battling for first and second in the West. Now moving over to the East Division, we have in first place the 11-1 Toronto Argonauts, who have just simply been unstoppable this season, already locking up first place in the East with 6 games left in their season. Their remaining schedule is home against Hamilton this week, at Winnipeg, at home against Edmonton, at home against Ottawa, on the road against Saskatchewan, and then on the road against Ottawa. So, it doesn't really matter what the rest of their season schedule's like. I think that, it could influence how the season turns out for other teams that they're playing. If they rest a lot of starters and, they kind of give away that game to, a team that's in the playoff race. But as for Toronto themselves, I mean, they're trying to just stay healthy, stay sharp for that playoff run that is going to be coming up in November here. So, not too much to say about the Toronto Argonauts. Let's move on to the number 2 seed, the Montreal Alouettes, who are 6-7 on the season. Their remaining schedule is at Calgary, at Ottawa, at home against Ottawa, at Edmonton, and at home against Hamilton. So, I think the game here against Calgary is huge for them. Obviously, the Alouettes are now tied with the Ticats in the standings after the events of this past week. So, I mean, there's a little bit of pressure on Montreal to get a little bit of a run going here because they've lost 4 in a row. They were 6-3 on the season. So, we'll have to see if they can get their season turned around in a hurry here. It starts in Calgary on Saturday afternoon, so we'll see what happens with that game. I think those 2 games against Ottawa are huge. Even if Ottawa is a team that seems very far out of the playoff race at this point, they still can make some noise in terms of influencing other teams' playoff chances and playoff seeding. And I think those 2 games against Montreal could be huge because if Ottawa can take a game off Montreal, that could be a difference between Hamilton finishing second or third this season. So I think that's huge. I think that game on the road against Edmonton is, not a gimme for the Montreal Alouettes. And of course, if these 2 teams have a tied record going into the last week of the season, that game, Hamilton and Montreal, could be huge for deciding home field advantage for that East semifinal there. So that's Montreal. And then at number 3, we have the Hamilton Tiger Cats, of course, who are tied with them with a 6-7 record. We'll go into it in a minute, but Montreal owns the tiebreaker over Hamilton. So Hamilton, in order to pass Montreal, has to have a better record than Montreal at the end of the season. Hamilton's remaining schedule is at Toronto versus Calgary, at Saskatchewan versus BC, and then to finish off at Montreal, as I was saying before. I think, this week against Toronto is a very interesting thing because this is the first week that Toronto's locked everything up in terms of first place in the East. So we'll see, again, if Toronto puts the full cavalry out there, goes all out to win this one. There might be a motivational, advantage for Hamilton in that one. But the way that Hamilton's shown against Toronto this year, I wouldn't count on a victory there. Then they're home against Calgary in a potentially massive game. I mean, there's still technically a possibility for, a West crossover team this year with potentially Calgary, but Calgary's going to have to go on a big winning streak here, and Hamilton's going to have, or Montreal's going to have just an outright collapse the rest of their season. So, I mean, that game against Calgary could be huge for the standings for both of those teams. And then against Saskatchewan, again, if Saskatchewan drops a game against Ottawa this week, things could really change here in terms of the complexion of the playoff race, because that would open the door for Calgary to get back in it. And, Hamilton plays Saskatchewan here in a few weeks, and, could Hamilton contribute to that potential skid for Saskatchewan as well? So that will be a very interesting game. Hamilton has traditionally struggled in Saskatchewan, so it'll be interesting to see how they play there this year. And then home against BC, I mean, they beat BC in BC, so there's probably some confidence in that building that Hamilton will win that game at home in the second last week of the season. And then the last week of the season, I mean, Montreal has really taken it to the Ticats the first couple games of the season, but the third matchup, I think Hamilton's a much different team than what they showed in the previous 2 matchups against Montreal. So it would be interesting to see if it's a kind of a winner take all for second place in the East in that matchup, who would win. So I think it's really interesting, the battle between Montreal and Hamilton for second place in the East here. And then at number 4 in the East, you have the Ottawa Red Blacks, who look like the worst team in the CFL this season, as I made a video this week explaining why I think that. They're 3-10 on the year. Their remaining schedule is at home against Saskatchewan, at home against Montreal, on the road against Montreal, on the road against Toronto, and then home against Toronto. So, I mean, like I said before, even though they look like they're far into the playoff race, I mean, they're going to have to win all of the rest of their games, I think, to have a chance of making the playoffs this year. But they have the ability to influence and, play spoiler for other teams' seasons. That's kind of the magic of a small league. Like, no team doesn't have any influence over the playoffs, even if they're so far out of it at this point of the season. So, I think, those 2 games against Montreal, like I was saying, if Ottawa can steal 1 or 2 games off of Montreal, because they played Montreal very close in those 2 games that they played them this season. If Ottawa can win those 2 matchups, it could be really interesting to see what happens in terms of the East standings. That could influence Hamilton potentially jumping Montreal in the standings. So I think those are just the standings and the remaining schedules for each teams. Now let's talk about some of the key tiebreakers that could come into play and just the overall path for each of these teams to make the playoffs. So the tiebreakers that are already decided are Montreal over Hamilton. Montreal's already won 2 games. Hamilton hasn't won any games in that season series. So that season series tiebreaker is decided. Hamilton has also swept Ottawa. So Ottawa, if they somehow get tied with Hamilton by the end of the season, they will not, pass Hamilton in the standings because Hamilton won all of the matchups against them this season. And then in the West, one that could come into play that's already clinched is Saskatchewan being over Edmonton. That could be huge because Edmonton's on a roll and potentially they could get to like 7 wins. Maybe Saskatchewan has a collapse, but if they're tied at 7-11, say, at the end of the season, then Saskatchewan would get into the playoffs because of those 2 previous victories. Now, in terms of undecided tiebreakers, We have Winnipeg versus BC, of course. Like I said, that's going to decide all the things for first place in the West, it looks like. Looks like a collision course in a couple of weeks, so we'll see how that plays out. Very, very important game. Probably the most important game left on the CFL schedule in terms of, the grander scheme of the CFL. And then BC versus Saskatchewan. They've split the first two games of the season series, I do believe, so technically it's still possible that Saskatchewan goes on a roll here. BC has a collapse, and Saskatchewan finishes second in the West, but we'll see what happens there. Calgary versus Saskatchewan, as I was saying before, 1-1 on the season series for those two teams. And I think that, if Calgary, like I said, if Saskatchewan drops a game here that's unexpected, like this week against Ottawa, that opens the door for Calgary to get right back in it, assuming they beat Montreal this week, because they could still win the tiebreaker over Saskatchewan in order to get third place in the West. And then I'll just throw this last one on the board. Montreal versus Ottawa has yet to been decided this season because they play each other 4 times. Montreal's won the first 2 matchups, but if Ottawa wins the last 2 matchups and Montreal won the first 2 games by a combined 8 points. So if Ottawa wins the next 2 games by a combined 9 points or more, because with these 4-game series, it's decided by point differential if they split 2-2. Ottawa would actually have the season tiebreakers. So, that would probably be the easiest way for the Ottawa Redblacks to get back into the playoff conversation here, but at this point, it does not seem likely. And, in terms of the teams that I think are going to make it, I think it's going to be the exact same standings that we see right now. I don't see, despite all those scenarios that I just explained, any team jumping up that is currently not in the playoff race. Maybe Calgary is the team that does it, just because of that winning culture they've had there, and maybe they have a last gasp left in them, and Saskatchewan maybe collapses down the stretch. But overall, I don't think that's very likely to happen. I think Saskatchewan holds on to the 3rd seed. I think that Montreal still holds on to the 2nd seed. I think they have done really well against Ottawa traditionally, despite what I was saying before. So I think that they'll win at least one of those games. I think they might win at Calgary this week. So I think they get to 8 or 9 wins. And then I think Hamilton probably finished with 8 or 9 wins as well. So basically, I think the standings are going to be the exact same as they are now if I had to predict. But I think there's still a lot of possibilities, as I was saying before, and I'm really excited to see how the rest of the season shakes out. And with that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the channel, be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think down in the comment section. Who's going to make the playoffs this season? Who's going to miss out? And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.